Hello folks, this is Year 2, Development in an African Context, Social Factors, Part 2. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick little recap of the last video, just in case you're watching these on completely different days or what have you. We are now in the last column of factors. We're working through 17 factors that could potentially explain why levels of development in sub-Saharan Africa are not very good. We're on the last column now, and the bit of the module booklet that starts on is page 44. Okay, so we have worked our way through education, and here are the relevant slides for that. The key ideas of that: firstly, it's a reminder that education is not necessarily free in all countries of the world. It is in the UK, but we therefore think it's free everywhere, and that's not true. How good is it? We talked in the last video about, okay, primary school enrolment has increased, more kids are going to school, but a significant percentage of them leave primary school without being able to read or write, so that's not great. There's this brain drain link, which we talked about, and there's a nice little case study of a man called Jelani Aliyu, and you can look at those hyperlinks should you wish, and there's a page in the module. It contributes to the poverty trap. If you don't get a very good standard of education, you kind of get stuck with regard to the job that you're capable of getting. And finally, education will be one of the factors that potentially could put off potential multinational company investment. Health is very similar. Healthcare is not necessarily free in all countries of the world, and that's also true of sub-Saharan Africa. How good is the quality of the healthcare? We also talked about the fact that people die in sub-Saharan Africa of things that they don't need to die from preventable causes. If they had better quality healthcare, if they had vaccinations, if they had all of these things, these people would not necessarily be dying. Low levels of healthcare, if you've got a poorly workforce, that will definitely put off multinational investment, and it would contribute to the poverty trap, because if you've got members of your household who are too poorly to work, it's going to affect income and quality of life. So there's quite a lot of overlap between healthcare and education, and there are some various diseases that you can investigate should you wish to. Welfare is very much linked to governance, the political factors that we've talked about, because a welfare state is one in which the people who are unable to look after themselves are looked after by the state. So, for example, old age pensioners, children, we get child benefit in the UK, we get pensions, we get sickness pay, etc., etc. Obviously, it requires money to do that, which we've kind of established sub-Saharan African countries don't have a lot of. But more importantly, it needs the government to prioritise that over military, over resources, over other things that they might prioritise. And I would suggest, we're going to talk about case studies in a minute, but looking at Botswana and Sierra Leone makes it a nice contrast for that. Gender. We talked about the fact that obviously, hopefully we're all fully paid up feminists, we're all true believers in equality, but if you need a little bit more convincing, have a look at the figure on page 48, which tells you that gender inequality has an economic impact. And therefore, if we're trying to establish why countries of sub-Saharan Africa might be struggling economically with their development, actually, gender inequality could really be part of that story, because in many sub-Saharan African countries there is quite a lot of inequality between men and women. And we didn't quite get on to the last one, which is ethnicity, tribalism, ethnic divisions. You can put it in loads of different sort of phrases. It's on pages 48 and 49 of your module booklet. And there's not very much to add, so don't worry about that. Essentially, we're talking about who people are, all right? And we mean that in a really deep-rooted kind of a way. And what we need to remember is the bottom bullet point on the slide in front of you. If we go back to colonialism, the scramble for Africa, which we've talked about in a previous video, we as in Europeans, kind of created the modern day borders of the continent of Africa, and it didn't really take into account existing tribal boundaries or kind of anything that was already there. So you could link ethnic divisions very much back to colonialism if you wished to. Obviously this is human geography and it kind of depends how you want to argue it and how you want to link it together. But anyway, regardless of how you argue that point, what we now have, and I'm going to jump to a case study. This is Sierra Leone, but it kind of applies to many, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We have a country in which you have different ethnic groups. All right, so this, as I say, is a map of Sierra Leone, and you can see you've got the Mende, the Temne, the Karanko, etc., etc. You've got these different ethnic groups. Now, these different ethnic groups might have very different belief systems, they might have very different ways of doing things, but these ethnic divisions generally mean that some of the tribes end up doing quite well, and they might be the ones who are more likely to be in power, they might be more likely to be running the country, and then you have other tribes, which might be smaller in number or less powerful or whatever, who tend not to be in power. And what that sets up really is conflict, fallings out, disagreements. And the trouble is that once you have ethnic divisions and you have groups of people who really don't like each other very much, and if that spills over into conflict and war, what that then means is war and conflict, it has the opposite impact on a country as development. Okay, development moves a country forwards. Any form of conflict and war will move a country backwards in terms of its development, and there is something to be said about the different ethnic groups. Also, just to go way back to the beginning of the module, just a reminder that truthfully there is no single indicator of development that is particularly brilliant for the whole of a country, because we talked about the core periphery model. So the core of a country is where everything's going a little bit better, the periphery things generally are not as good. But we also talked about gender differences and ethnic differences. So you would also find that some ethnic groups probably had better levels of quality of life than others, longer life expectancies, better rates of education, and so on and so forth. All right, so it's not a huge part of this module, it's just something to be aware of. Now, that brings us to the end of the social factors. There are 5 of them. All of the others, there have been 4, but there are 5 social factors, which means it's time to begin to apply them a little bit to your 5 countries. And I would recommend that Botswana and Sierra Leone make a really nice contrast for social factors. Burkina Faso is also quite good, but I would generally focus on Botswana and Sierra Leone. So Botswana, as we've said many times, is kind of at the top of the pile of our 5 countries for all sorts of reasons. They've got a really good education system, universities and so on, and if you want to know more about it, you can obviously open the hyperlinks. Sierra Leone's education system is somewhat different, okay? Health. Now, here is a little interesting bit. Botswana is widely regarded as a paradox. Now, a paradox means something that doesn't quite add up, it doesn't quite make sense. As I've literally just said, everything in Botswana is going quite well. They're the most developed of our 5 countries. They've got democracy, they have diamonds, everything's ticking along quite nicely, with one notable exception. They have the highest rate of HIV and AIDS in the whole of the continent. So not just of our 5 countries, but actually of the whole of Africa. And it's called the paradox of Botswana. So it just gives you something else to talk about with Botswana, and as you can see, the hyperlinks should you choose to open and give you more information. Sierra Leone is quite interesting because they had a reasonably recent Ebola outbreak, and that gives some interesting things to talk about. You could also, I have to confess I haven't had a chance to Google this myself, you could also have a look at how our 5 countries are being affected by coronavirus, which might give you some sort of interesting, right bang up to date information to include. Welfare, essentially, ladies and gents, Botswana has got a really good welfare state. There's lots of information on page 47 about that. It's very similar to the British system. Sierra Leone, not so much. They have part of the government that is meant to be kind of looking at welfare and gender and all sorts of things. Please excuse the dog barking. But it's all... It's there in name, but it's not very effective. And if you do a bit of Google searching, you will figure that out. Gender equality, all sorts of hyperlinks there. The governments of sub-Saharan Africa are saying the right things in terms of they know that they need to improve gender equality. They really do, but it's quite hard maybe to change people's belief systems. If you've got I would call entrenched beliefs among your people about women being homemakers, child rearers, etc., etc. It takes a long time to change people's minds about that. So they're heading in the right direction, but gosh, it's going to be a mountain to climb. And there are some really brilliant websites that I've listed there. I would say that Burkina Faso is quite an interesting one to include here, because women in Burkina Faso really have had a great struggle to achieve gender equality. Ethnic divisions. People from Botswana generally regard themselves as Batswana, which is a brilliant, brilliant word. What that means is they see themselves as people from Botswana, and then second to that, they might see themselves as from their particular ethnic group. So for me, as an example, I see myself as British. I don't see myself as English. That's just me. Some people might identify much more, you know, if, for example, people from Wales might think of themselves as being Welsh as opposed to British. It's just interesting. Whereas if you lived in Sierra Leone, actually the ethnic group that you belong to has led to civil war. It's led to conflict over diamonds, if we go way back to like the first set of factors. So again, Sierra Leone and Botswana make a really interesting pair of case studies. So use the hyperlinks in the PowerPoint, and also maybe do a little bit of Google searching. As I said, focus on those 2 countries. A little bit of a nod to Burkina Faso could be interesting, but if you're interested and you want to look at the other 5 of our 5 countries, yeah, by all means, I'm not saying don't do that. So here's the exciting news, ladies and gents, if I can get my computer to work. That's the end of the 17 factors. So what I'm going to be doing in my next video will be to start pulling them all together, linking them, and trying to do that sort of thing. But we've made it to the end. Hurrah! Congratulations. Not of the module, let me emphasise, not of the module, but of the 17 factors. Well done!